Well, thank you all for coming tonight on this wonderful rainy night where I believe the drought area is also getting some rain. So, woohoo, yes. So first of all, I'd like to just thank the traditional owners of this land and acknowledge the incredible way they used to take care of this land. So I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and hopefully really fine ones in the future. So tonight we have two great activists discussing our Australia, advancing human rights and the common good. And Australia seems to have become something of an international embarrassment when it comes to its non-observation of human rights obligations. Our governments continue to mistreat asylum seekers who come to these shores avoiding persecution, and shamefully our governments have regarded the deliberate infliction of cruelty as a viable policy option. Unbelievable. Our governments have presided over housing unaffordability, youth unemployment, mass incarceration of Indigenous people, wage stagnation. Recently, of course, we have banking misconduct and diminished union power. All symptoms of a society in deep trouble. And then today, of course, the ABC, so also not a good sign at all. And basically, it seems to be a government serving their own interests and corporate interests more and more. So what can we do to restore our faith in our government and Australia's standing in the world as far as human rights are concerned? How can Australia live up to the ideal of the common good? Tonight we're honoured to have GetUp's Director of Human Rights, Shen, Narayanasamy, and Director of the Green Institute, Tim Hollow, here to discuss these issues. So we're going to start with Tim, and then they will have 20 minutes each, and then they will talk amongst themselves for us to hear for about 20 minutes, or we may go into questions and answers, and stimulate with them some of our questions. So first of all, just to introduce you to Tim Hollow, who is the Executive Director of the Green Institute in Canberra. Last August, he gave a talk here entitled Common Good, Democratic Futures for People and Planet, and he was very well received, so we've invited him back again for another session. He's a highly respected environmentalist and a musician, having worked for organizations such as the Greens, Greenpeace, 350.org, and he's performed in venues as diverse as Woodford Folk Festival and Carnegie Hall in New York. So that's pretty diverse. The Green Institute is an Australian non-profit organisation aiming to support green community-wide change grounded on the principles of ecology, social justice, democracy, non-violence, sustainability, and respect for diversity. And I'd like to quote just a little bit from their mission statement, which was quite long, but I found very fascinating. The neoliberal consensus our system rests on is rapidly disintegrating, and in a very real sense, the racism, sexism, violence, and denialism now so prevalent in our politics is the predictable result of 2 generations of corporate-led hyper-individualism. But we have a better story to overcome alienation, a story of compassion rather than hate, of optimism rather than revenge, of cooperation rather than splintering, where the right solutions not only appeal to our baser instincts, but also will never make life better for most people. Frankly, it's not their intention. Our solutions are designed to improve people's lives in a fairer and greener world. So let's have a really warm Mullumbimby round of applause for Tim Hollow.
Thank you very much. Article 1.1. Mother Earth is an indivisible, self-regulating community of interrelated beings, each of whom is defined by its relationships within this community. Article 1.2. These fundamental rights, freedoms and duties are inherent to all beings. Consequently, they are inalienable, cannot be abolished by law. Article 1.5. The rights of each being are limited by the rights of other beings to the extent necessary to maintain the integrity, balance and health of the communities within which it exists. Article 3. Every being has A. The right to exist, B. The right to habitat or place to be, E. The right to be free from pollution, and F. The freedom to relate to other beings and to participate in communities of beings in accordance with its nature. These words are from the draft Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, a draft which emerged from the Cochabamba World Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth in 2010. They're closely associated with Bolivian President Evo Morales and the powerful blend of socialist, environmental and indigenous politics known as Buen Vivir, which he's a key figure in. And in starting with these words, I also want to acknowledge that we are meeting here today on the land of the Bundjalung Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people who may be here tonight. I acknowledge that this is stolen land and that we have much to learn from Indigenous peoples in redesigning our system, which we have allowed to get utterly out of balance. And it's balance and rebalancing that I want to talk to you about tonight. So these words from the draft declaration are wonderful, beautiful ideas. They're a key element of a global push that's been going on for some decades now to enshrine in law and in our institutions rights for nature. I first came across the concept of rights for nature in my undergrad law degree back in the 1990s through a 1972 article by Professor Christopher Stone called "Should Trees Have Standing?", which challenged the idea that the natural world, that trees should be treated only as objects in the eyes of the law, as property. Stone's work doesn't explicitly draw on Indigenous legal systems, but that is the ancient tradition that his ideas form part of. And it's in that space where much of the progress in the decades since has taken place. You can find it in the adoption of new constitutions by Bolivia and Ecuador, which, in institutionalising Buen Vivir-based states, enshrine rights for the natural world. You can see it in the granting of legal rights to river systems in New Zealand and in India to be implemented through the voices of Indigenous peoples. This progress is inspiring and fascinating. It prefigures a new and better way of governing in common for the common good. The common good of all people, of course, but also of the natural world which we are part of and indivisible from. But how much would change if we adopted a rights of nature framework right now? If the draft declaration became international law and was reflected in domestic laws? Let me start to answer that question by quoting from one of the most famous United Nations declarations of all, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood. Article 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. Article 5, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 7, all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. Article 14.1, everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Article 21, everyone has the right to peaceful assembly and association. Article 21.1, everyone has the right to take part in the government of his or her country, directly or through freely chosen representatives. These rights exist. They have been written into law internationally 70 years ago and through large parts of the world domestically. Are they honoured? Australia's abrogation of the right to seek asylum and our effective torture of asylum seekers in the prison camps on Manus and Nauru are among the most blatant ways in which we breach this most fundamental declaration of rights. But what about equality before the law, non-discrimination based on race, colour, sex, freedom of assembly, taking part in government, access to justice? Let me simply mention racial profiling of Indigenous kids or people of Middle Eastern appearance by police forces, the ongoing gender pay gap effectively supported by government policy from tax to super and beyond. Governments chasing Centrelink debt with far greater gusto than they chase corporate tax avoidance. A court system which gives far greater access to those with financial resources than those without, aided and abetted by cut after cut to legal aid and Aboriginal legal services. The access corporations and the rich have to politicians which massively outweighs access by citizens and constituents. The negotiation of major international trade deals such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership behind closed doors by corporations for corporations, and including in them provisions such as investor-state dispute resolution, which allows corporations to sue governments when citizens can't. Threats to deregister unions for small misdemeanours while backing corporate regulators with no teeth and clearly no interest in calling corporations to account. And the whittling away of the right to dissent, delegitimising, criminalising protest by governments, Labor and Liberal, state and federal. I'm sure everyone in this room can add to that list with examples of your own. How and why is this the case when human rights are enshrined in international law? My answer is because our system is utterly out of balance. Because we are living not in the age of human rights and rights of nature, but in the age of the divine right of corporations. And it is worth being very clear about the fact that this is directly connected not just to those examples where the corporate interest directly trumps the public interest, but also to those examples that we might characterise as prejudice. Prejudice always exists, yes, but those in power always use it to their benefit. Divide and conquer is the central way they maintain their dominance, misdirecting community anger by encouraging people to punch down instead of up. In our unbalanced system, the rights of corporations trump all others. The right to make a profit outweighs human rights, civil and political rights, and nature has no rights at all. This, to me, is the crux of the argument for rights for nature, an argument which, as I've said, I find very exciting and positive. Simply legislating those rights is insufficient. We need to change the system that has led them to be ignored. Otherwise, they will continue to be sidelined or end up being pitted against human and civil and political rights. This is what I conceptualise as rebalancing rights. So how do we do that? How do we build a system where human rights and rights of nature are the prime directives, if you will, and corporations exist to support those, not in competition with them? The primary task is to pull back the power of corporations in order to create space for humans and nature. Let's look at some ideas. Obvious ones first. Donations reform, lobbyist reform, a federal ICAC with teeth. These are all mechanisms to challenge and hopefully at least loosen the stranglehold that corporations have over government decision making. Corporate donations to political parties, representatives and campaigns should simply be illegal, and individual donations should be capped at a low level, and the revolving door between politicians, senior advisors and lobbyists should be firmly closed. Any system which allows those with more money to pay for greater access to decision makers or is based on who you know is fundamentally corrupting and anti-democratic. The human rights principles of access to justice, to decision makers and to public service, of equality before the law, the need for balance, demand that we act on these. Next, thanks to the Banking Royal Commission, is the fact that we now can see very plainly that corporate regulation in this country is mostly a gentle slap with a wet piece of lettuce, or at worst, a wink, a nod, and a quiet handshake. ASIC, which consistently fails to prosecute corporations for wrongdoing, needs to have its regulatory powers handed to the ACCC. But more than that, we need a root and branch review of how corporations are regulated and what is to be done when they breach their legal obligations. Again, human rights principles require equality before the law. When corporations and the rich can breach the law and get away with it, while the poor, the indigenous people of this land, those with less deep pockets, get the book thrown at them, we are hugely out of balance. Another idea which is building a new head of steam, thanks to the collapse of faith in trickle-down economics, is to tax corporations fairly. Hugely profitable corporations should pay more tax, and we must close the massive loopholes that enable 1 in 3 of the largest corporations operating in Australia to pay no tax at all. Corporations rely on the community, on a healthy environment, and on government for their existence, let alone for their profit. Balance requires that they contribute their fair share. Another proposal which is starting to be discussed is to not just stop, but begin to reverse privatisation of government services. Now, privatisation is unpopular and lines private pockets instead of servicing public needs. But in my view, it's also in breach of human rights principles, of the right for all citizens to take part in government. Government or community or cooperative delivery of public services enables citizens to take part, while privatisation shuts the door, by definition. Employment and social services, schools, electricity, water, transport, hospitals and primary healthcare. These are public goods, and they shouldn't be provided for profit. An important differentiation that I've made between standard socialism and ecological socialism is that they don't necessarily need to be delivered by centralised government either, as we just heard about Innova. They can be effectively delivered by community or cooperative ownership and management. These are equally viable and in some cases more effective ways of meeting that obligation to enable citizens to take part, and can and should be encouraged and supported by government policy. A related area which is starting to be seriously considered is to hand the community and employees a stake in ownership and control of major corporations. When a board is made up entirely of business people, usually rich white men, and when shareholders are there only to seek profit, it's no surprise that social and environmental obligations are sidelined or deliberately circumvented. Now, the UK's Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, has recently announced a policy to require all corporations that employ more than 250 people to gradually transfer 10% of their shares into an inclusive ownership fund managed by employees cooperatively. This effectively makes all large corporations at least 10% cooperatives. It gives workers dividends for the work and the wealth that they create, and makes employee groups effectively institutional shareholders, able to drive change in governance in the companies they work for. McDonnell has also raised requiring worker representation on boards, as has US Senator Elizabeth Warren and the ACTU here in Australia. These big ideas aren't silver bullets and they might not be perfect, but at heart, democratising corporate ownership and control must be part of a process of rebalancing rights. An idea currently at the margins is divestiture, harking back to the antitrust laws of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, actively breaking up corporations that are too big. Too big to fail means too big to operate independently of the political system. It effectively guarantees privatising of profit and socialising of risk. It guarantees inappropriate power concentrated in too few hands. The Greens have raised this in the context of banks and media companies, both areas where recently governments have undone long-standing regulation limiting the size and market reach of companies. Enabling private profit to trump the public interest in this way is fundamentally unbalanced. Now the corker, the central challenge for me. Corporations are given the privilege of limited liability and legal personhood, and there must be a quid pro quo for those privileges. Combining them with a single-minded focus on the profit motive is the complete opposite of quid pro quo. It is a recipe for disaster. It rewards selfishness, punishes sharing and cooperation, and dismisses any stewardship responsibilities to other humans and to the natural world. It is fundamentally at odds with any conception of human rights, civil and political rights, and rights for nature. If corporations are to be treated as legal persons, then they must be required to act more fully as persons, rather than purely selfish sociopaths. While there have long been alternative models available, not-for-profits, B Corps, cooperatives, the problem lies not with those who want to behave appropriately, but with those who don't. And Elizabeth Warren's recently announced Accountable Capitalism Bill is the first major principle I've ever seen to regulate this, based on the principle that the right to legal personhood carries with it the moral obligations of personhood. The centrepiece of Warren's bill would require any corporation with an annual revenue of over $1 billion to obtain a federal charter of corporate citizenship. This would require them at law to act in the interests not just of shareholder profit, but of all relevant stakeholders, customers, employees, and the communities in which they operate. There's a lot of details still to be put on these bones, but the fact that this has been raised by a serious potential US presidential candidate is very promising. By ensuring that corporations, by design, serve the community and the natural world, we will begin to rebalance the system. There's lots of other ideas that are worth exploring, but we don't have time tonight just to mention revisiting the minimum reserves that banks have to hold, reversing the corporatisation of education, health, politics broadly, public broadcasting, and introducing alternatives to GDP. But I must move on, in the very limited time remaining, to note a few central ideas on the other side of the ledger. Most fundamentally, we need to develop a Bill of Rights. Our High Court has read implied rights into our Constitution, and various states and territories have human rights acts. But Australia is the only country in the OECD not to have a National Bill of Rights. In that context, it's astonishing that we aren't in a worse position than we are. My view, to link to a second topic, is that we should develop a Bill of Rights through a national, participatory, deliberative democratic process involving all Australians. Taking part in government is a fundamental human right, and participatory democracy is the deepest, most powerful way of doing so. Rebalancing rights is not just about getting corporations out of politics, but bringing the people back in. What better space to practice that in than in developing a Bill of Rights? Of course, direct participatory democratic processes aren't the only way to participate in decision-making. The right to dissent, advocacy and protest is vital. As part of rebalancing rights, we need not only to stop the crushing of civil society and unions by government, but actively work to support them. I would, of course, love to see rights of nature enshrined in a Bill of Rights. What those rights should be and how they're to be implemented will be critical questions. For instance, who will be the Lorax who speaks for the trees? Indigenous leadership in this space will be vital, of course, but it can't and shouldn't be solely their responsibility. We need to learn from Indigenous wisdom and governance and bring it into our system in new ways. Should natural systems be granted legal personhood? Would that mean that they had obligations as well as rights? And how would that work? How would different natural systems legally interact with each other? Who decides how to balance their rights and weigh them against human rights? A final observation that these questions bring to the surface. There's long been a critique of the rights framework, that they are a problematically individualistic way of seeing the world. But a rights of nature approach allows us to challenge that view. Our adversarial system allows us only to see how rights and rights holders compete with each other. But in the natural world, healthy competition is balanced with healthy cooperation. Once we rebalance rights, ensuring that corporations serve the interests of human society and the natural world we are part of, we can see that rights can, in fact, be held and exercised in common. And that would be true balance. Thank you.
And also we are in Mullumbimby trying to create a human Bill of Rights. And if anyone would like to attend, it's just the little church hall at the end of this block on the Anglican Church Hall, and it's October the 8th, Monday at 6 o'clock. And we've got quite a long way already, so anyone who would like to come would be most welcome. So I am super delighted and honoured to welcome to the stage a woman for whom I have great admiration, and I think you'll soon find out why. She is the Human Rights Campaign Director of GetUp, and her name is Shen Narayanasamy. And as many of you may know, GetUp now has over 1 million members in Australia, which, as we are 25 million in number almost, means that about 1 in 20 of us over the age of 15 is actually a member of GetUp. So I think that's quite an achievement. The motto of GetUp is People, Power, Impact. And it's an independent movement to build a progressive Australia and bring participation back to our democracy. GetUp campaigns on human rights, economic fairness, and democratic integrity. I also noticed that it has 11,900 web pages linked to it who refer to GetUp, whereas in comparison, our beloved Ngara so far has 220. So we have a little ways to go, but it's not bad, not bad. So Shen is a lawyer. She's an asylum seeker advocate and a corporate activist, and she has 2 young children, so you can imagine how busy she is. She lives in Melbourne. And also Shen's family adopted a young Tamil refugee when he finally got out of 4 years of detention. So after university, she joined a corporate law firm, and she managed to, after that, get her dream job, which was as an economic justice advocate for Oxfam. In her free time, she began to meet with a loose collective of refugee activists who probably inspired her to start taking up the fight against Transfield Services, the company that manages Australia's offshore detention program with its alleged complicity in human rights abuses. And I think I'm right in saying that the government pays Transfield something like 1.4 million a week, is it, or is it a day?
3 billion a year.
There you go. So I'm sure she's going to tell us more about that. Imagine how well that money could be spent. So she forced them to think, So the company that manages the detention centres, and she forced them to think not just about the moral and ethical components of their business, but also the financial and legal implications. She makes quite an impact wherever she goes, even if I know that when she used to go around to all these corporate meetings with her 2 young kids, and at one time one of her little one apparently spewed all over the director's shoes. But anyway, apparently they love her. They realize that her mission is great. And many corporate people would actually really like to support her, even if only for realizing the financial loss, that the money that's being wasted. So GetUp's most recent project was to make it known that Adani had broken the law against doing illegal groundwater drilling, and a huge petition went out for that. I'm sure many of us signed it. So all power to this awesome lady, and let's again give a really warm round of Mullumbimby applause for Shen Narayanasamy. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Hello. Thank you for having me here tonight. I feel like I'm in a very warm room. Yes, I always have to do this. Part of being very short. I even wore heels. And I put on some lipstick for you all. I hope you're all noticing. It's unusual for a mum of two. I hope I've done it correctly. I usually have the great privilege of talking about many of the human rights issues that I work on at GetUp. I'm paid, which is an unusual situation for an activist to be, to work on some of the grittiest human rights issues this country has. So my days usually consist of talking to people who are in terrible circumstances and fighting an often losing battle. And so usually when I'm asked to talk about human rights issues, I'll tell you a little bit about that story. We'll talk through some of the things that we all know exist in this country, and then I might finish up with a few things that I think you can do. But I am sensing from this room, and I also got a heads up from Richard and Jen, that I feel like the majority of you know that. So I'm going to go out on a limb tonight, and I'm going to suggest that we go down a rabbit hole, not of the human rights issues that I think you're all well aware of, and if anything, I think many of you have been fighting the good fight on them for a long time now, but actually to talk through, in a moment we don't usually get in this kind of never-ending fight, about the threads of what the other side has been doing and how they've been knitted together in complex ways in the midst of a neoliberal state to create a mask that exists over all of us and the body politic, which have enabled politicians, and in many cases big business, to encourage us to fear and divide against each other. So I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say that instead of talking about those human rights issues, let's talk about the mask that is broadly encapsulated, I think, by the phrase, and I'll give you a drink at the bar if you can remember who said it, I will decide who comes into this country and the circumstances in which they come. Oh God, I can't buy all of you a beer. I take that back, I'm sorry. And in order to do so, there's one thing I'd like to do before I begin, and that is to acknowledge again the traditional owners of this land, the Bundjalung people, and other First Nations in this room, and acknowledge their elders past and present. And that's not just because it's an important matter of protocol and respect, but also because if we are going to start discussing who comes into this country and the circumstances on which they come, we need to acknowledge the centrality of invasion and the fact of stolen land. Because in everything that I do as a human rights advocate, and in this very story tonight, it all leads back there. And we have, none of us, any real future and positive vision in this country if it doesn't have at its central core justice, reparations and return of land to Indigenous peoples. And I know I reflect that aspiration from everyone in the room tonight. Okay, so let's take this journey, and like all good journeys, it starts in a spreadsheet. So what I was doing a year and a half ago was asking what I thought was quite a basic question, and it was, how many people arrived by boat in this country at the peak of boat hysteria, and how many people arrived by plane? And so I started looking at the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the migration, the back pages of the Department of Home Affairs, and I trawled through and I found, okay, at its very dizzying peak in 2013, you know, when you can, sorry, not 2013, 2009. I should actually remember what I'm looking at when I'm talking statistics. My partner often says that I'm a bit flexible with them. 25,132 people arrived by boat, which is a lot. You know, if you told me 25,000, that's a lot of people. How many boats? And then I thought, okay, well, how many came by plane? And I excluded tourists, which is, you know, normal. And I thought, all right, permanent migrants, 100,000. Okay, permanent migrants. All right, what about everybody who can work in this country, right? Everybody's got work, right? So permanent migrants, okay. 457 visas, okay. Students can work in this country, international students. Working holiday makers, and went through and through and through all the visa classes. And I totted it up, and then my jaw fell. I thought, no, I've done it wrong. Maths was never my strong point, I'm going to do it again. And I did it 3 times. And the figure that came out over the course of the exact same year that 25,000 people arrived by boat was 800,000. I thought, what? 800,000 people arrived in this country and I didn't notice? I mean, that's 2,000 a day. That means through our airports, more people arrived in a week in that year than had arrived in the entirety of the year by boat. I thought, no, this can't be right. And so then I went back and I did the spreadsheet for the last 25 years. And then I saw that the numbers arriving by plane, or the numbers of migrants into this country, had a relatively steady line until the election of one John Winston Howard. I thought, hang on a second, I can't be getting this right. I mean, I remember John Howard. I remember that election where he thumped that lectern and said, we will decide who comes into this country and the circumstances in which they come. I don't remember anything about John Howard talking about how he was going to preside over a period in Australia's history where we had the highest amount of migration per capita. That man, John Howard, presided over the highest migration period we've seen. No. So I went back and I looked at his speech. I looked at the entirety of that speech where he thumped that lectern around who comes. And I looked for anything about migration, anything about how transforming Australia from a country of permanent migration to a country in which we had vast numbers arriving on crappy short-term visas to be working and then thrown back was a central part of his entire vision for the nation. Not a thing. I thought, hang on a second. How is it possible that this country has seen an immigration situation where we have 800,000 arriving by plane and the whole country goes absolutely troppo over 25,000 coming by boat? Is it possible that this was deliberate? I know it's big to accuse John Howard of being somehow disingenuous, but I'm going to go there. And I think when you do go there, when you ask the question, hang on a second, how did we fall for that? I think you've got to credit the public with some level of sensibility. Because when you go through all of the discussions from John Howard on, you see continuing reference to people arriving by boat and absolutely zero debate. And I'm talking zero. Like I looked for the figure that totted up every year the number of permanent and long-term temporary migration in this country, and I couldn't find it. I went looking for the number of temporary migrants and how it impacted what's called the net migration statistic in this country. And John Howard, in the entirety of the time that he was in power, didn't let them add temporary migrants into that number. They literally didn't collect the statistic. And instead what you have is continual reference to people arriving by boat. Continual reference. And it goes for nearly 15 years. An ongoing blathering from the pulpits of our politicians, from John Laws, from radio stations, from TV, about how we are all under imminent threat from people arriving by boat, and not a word about how migration is radically changing this country. And I ask the question, why? Because I always like in these situations to ask the question, why and who's winning? I thought, okay, well, let's see. Maybe this is a good deal for migrants, because that's where people usually go, right? Large numbers of migrants, 800,000, oh, lucky them. And you know, the few occasions where there's been some mention of it, because it got bloody hard to cover up the fact that this was happening. People have said, oh, well, yes, we've got a great migration program and everyone's very happy with it, but oh, gee, these asylum seekers. And so I thought, maybe migrants are getting a good deal out of it. And then I looked closely. It didn't take much long to do that either. So coming to this country on a temporary visa, what do you get? You know, we used to come, and many people here, we've just had a conversation at the table about people's migration history to this country, those of us who are not from First Nations backgrounds. We used to come here and get a permanent visa. People didn't even get citizenship. You didn't really need it. You had the same rights the minute your feet touch ground. Temporary migrants in this country, what do they get? They don't get access to welfare. They barely get access to Medicare. They don't even if their children get concession cards on public transport. They're here for 1 year, maybe 2. I can give you a list of the inquiries in Parliament over the last 10 years that have told us repeatedly that the situation of the hundreds of thousands of temporary migrants in this country, the current number is 1.2 million. 1 in 10 of the labour force are temporary migrants. And their situation in many cases is largely akin to modern slavery. Underpaid, exploited, vulnerable, on their own. Do you know what the waiting list is for family reunion? If I put in to get my sister here, how long do I have to wait? 2 years? 30. Who knew that? I'm not offering anybody a drink tonight. Thank you. 30 years. 30. The current waiting list, oh no, it gets better. The current waiting list is 30 years, but if you pay $100,000, you can jump it. How's that for deciding who comes here and the circumstances in which they come?
Huge options.
Exactly. So the question then becomes, so we've largely changed the entirety of our migration program, and I could go on and on and on and on, and I'm happy to later tonight. But in reality, the situation for migrants is not only now incredibly temporary, and right after right is being clawed away, but if you were to talk to a person of African Australian background in Melbourne right now, what would they tell you? That there's a 16-year-old Sudanese boy right now in immigration detention who was arrested on criminal charges, not violence related, property theft related. That boy is sitting in immigration detention because the minister wants to cancel his visa. He's got PR. He wants to cancel his PR, and when he's 18, throw that boy back after 2 years in immigration detention to Sudan with his family here. 1,000 people this year in that situation have been deported by this minister. You've got people from Czechoslovakian background who've been here since they were 9 and had PR. They've gone back. Thrown back. So the situation isn't just that we are creating 2 classes of people in this society. We are creating an exploited, vulnerable underclass, but we are grabbing rights from them as we go along. We are punishing them, we're making them sign good behaviour contracts, where their behaviour, depending on what Peter Dutton and Border Force says, means they can be tossed into detention with very little appeal rights. We're taking away rights to lawyers, and we are basically creating for ourselves, ironically, what John Howard himself stood up and did say, which is that Australia's system of permanent migration is what sets us apart, and we don't want to become a guest worker economy like that of Europe. So migrants aren't really winning. Is the Australian public winning? People who do have citizenship. Well, I mean, they're being told that all of their problems are because of migrants. What's happening to our labour force? Who's benefiting from the situation where people are being brought into this country, given very little rights, stay here for 1 or 2 years and are thrown back or go through an increasingly difficult pathway to get permanence and citizenship?
Gina Reinhardt.
Yes, Gina Reinhardt. How much do you think these people are being paid? And if employers, if big business are given the opportunity to pay people less than minimum wage, what do you think they'll do? What does that do to all of us? Well, what it does mean is that Pauline Hanson gets votes by the bucket loads in rural and regional Australia because they see the reality that the vast majority of our rural workforce, horticultural industry, abattoirs, who's there? Migrant workers. Inside the mines, migrant workers. Even in some of our renewable energy, migrant workers. And how easy is it? It's the oldest trick in the book to whip up fear and hate and target it to that outsider. And who benefits? Well, it's easy. One, we have delivered, thanks to John Howard and subsequent all sides of politics, we have delivered a 15-year trajectory towards racism, derision, increasing anti-democratic rights and increasing competition between those of us who think we're Australian and we deserve everything here and those of us who aren't. And unfortunately, that's usually racialised. And what have we delivered? Politicians, an ability for the last 15 years to run election after election on this issue of who comes here and why. One of my favourite quotes on this was, I love it when politicians forget that it's a line. And one of them, she was the Liberal member, she lost in the last election, was asked about why she thought asylum seekers was such a big problem. And she said, well, you know, the traffic on the M1 is terrible. And 50,000 people coming to this country, I mean, that's what we're talking about. And everyone mocked her, I mocked her. But really, the poor woman was just confused because her instructions were clear. Just go out there and inflame, and say it's all asylum seekers. And in the end, the Australian public not only has had that situation where politicians are talking to them about it like this, but they've actually had to deal with the reality of an infrastructure and a body politic that hasn't got to the point of understanding or even knowing about the numbers coming. So Australian politicians have done quite well out of this. Do you know the other thing that's done quite well? A neoliberal growth-based economy. Because we're growing, I mean, everything says we're growing. We've had, 12 years of uninterrupted growth. You know why? Because we've had a bucket load of migrants coming through working for under minimum wage. For an increasing share of a decreasing pie. Who else has benefited? Business. Big business. Gina Reinhardt has benefited. 7-Eleven has benefited. We've just had businesses very, very quietly been supporting and whispering in the ear of politicians for a long time that immigration is good for business. Immigration is good, and it can be good for economies in many different ways. But exploiting immigrants and dividing the population against them is not good. The other people, and this is what makes this difficult, in some ways good, is us. Those of us that enjoy the reality that if we were to turn around and look at who picked our fruit, look at who cleaned the offices in the buildings that, you know, I and my friends work at, if we had to ask the question, what do us as citizens enjoy and others don't, we're benefiting from this. And this is also why I wanted to discuss this tonight here. Because if the reality of the situation is that for the last 15 years we have fallen for an immigration con in this country, we have absolutely hook, line and sinker fallen for it. We have been distracted by people in detention camps and boats. We've presumed that that is the totality of what's going on. And then on the other end, we've had huge numbers arriving in this country with very little rights. And we have watched as essentially under our very noses, two legal classes of people have been created in this country. And then we have watched as legislation after legislation has gone through this parliament, the last of which thankfully we blocked, was around making migrants take an English test. and thought, oh yeah, well that makes sense. You know, well, people need to learn to speak English, as opposed to going, hang on a second, what are they doing? So if people have to take an English test, and we know who's going to fail that test, in fact it's completely obvious, it's people from Asian language backgrounds. Who's coming on the temporary visas? If people are here on temporary visas and they're failing an English language test, what's happening to them? Are they still here? Oh yeah, they're still here. But they're ever more vulnerable. They have no legal rights. They're just failing English test after English test and working below minimum wage at 7-Eleven. It's a joke. But what it allows us to do, and this is the benefit of being part of a movement, is can you imagine, and I put this to all of you here tonight, can you imagine if in Mullumbimby you joined hands with migrant workers and said to Canberra, together or nothing, we want equal rights for all of us. We want permanency. We don't want you to continue giving temporary migrants this raw deal. Our liberation is bound up together. Do you know how dangerous that would be? Do you know how radical that would be to the Gina Rineharts? Because what they rely on and what the next election will be about is the continued fear, division and scramble over an ever-shrinking pie between poorer Australia, rural and regional Australia and migrant workers. So that's what I want to say to you tonight. I don't have pat things that I would usually say sometimes about signing a petition. I have a really big challenge, and that is to join hands with the people that are around you, that are in this very area, in this very region. Ask them how they're going. Do you know that's how the 7-Eleven visa thing started, the 7-Eleven inquiry started? This bloke went round to his 7-Eleven and said, oh, just out of interest, he'd been going there every morning to get milk. What are you paid? And then when they told him, he was like, I feel like that might be $10 below minimum wage. That's the thing about the neoliberalism, and that's the thing about the way racism works, and that's the thing about what's happened to us, is that the opportunities for change are literally outside our doors. And if we were to join hands, and we would deliver such a dangerous coalition, and a dangerous coalition which not only had solidarity with each other, but solidarity with all of us here who inhabit this nation, and actually pose a threat to the comfortable immigration con that government, big business, and indeed politicians of all stripes think they have as solid. So that's my challenge to you. Give it a go. Should I go first?
Sure.
I had a question for Tim actually, which was, given what you were saying about human rights or rights for nature, it was really interesting concept, because I was thinking about this. If you have rights, then you potentially also have prejudice and you have culture around the holder of the right or the thing that has the right. So I was thinking about this with that lens. When you consider that Australia has absolutely failed to deal with climate change in any real way, and in fact we saw the toppling of a Prime Minister very soon after he tried to propose a very weak attempt at addressing it. To what degree do you think that there is a strong culture of antipathy and hatred of the natural and nature in this country?
Interesting. I think it's probably quite closely related, I guess, is my feeling, to the point that you made that I'd also adverted to, that the dividing and conquering is being done by those in power deliberately. I don't think there is a hatred of the natural world by the vast majority of people. I think there is a very small minority of people who do, you know, the thing that you get of people, you know, saying, I've chosen to buy a Hummer and churn through as much petrol as I can because I just think it's my right and I want to just go out and destroy their, you know, the horrific story that we've seen in the last couple of months of the person who's poisoned 400 spectacular wedge-tailed eagles. There are very, very occasional examples of that, of people taking out, I think, their anger and their frustration on the natural world and seeing that as hate. But I think the hatred that we see in the political discourse is very much driven by the desire to drive people apart and to disconnect us from each other and from the natural world. I see them as integrally interrelated. So, does that?
Yeah. Sorry, yes. Yeah, that's really interesting because it's often a question that we think about. And it doesn't seem important, but in some ways it is. To what degree is it ideological and to what degree is it intentional? Sorry, hang on. I'm probably doing this. Instruct me if I'm doing this wrong. The other question that I had on this was in terms of corporations. Given what we've seen of the Banking Royal Commission and how difficult it was to even get that up, as weak as it, I mean, it hasn't been weak largely because there's been so much to uncover, but broadly speaking, the terms were very limited. What's your proposal for how we shift this dynamic to get even part way through to where you were talking about in your speech?
It's shifting incredibly fast. I think it's one of those, it's building its own momentum, and the Banking Royal Commission is a prime example of that. Malcolm Turnbull's interesting throwaway comment when it was announced is that the corporate capitalism isn't on trial. well, it is now. Actually, it is, and that view is those ideas are spreading incredibly fast. I actually think it's on the way. The extent to which things are shifting in the US and the UK at the moment in politics is absolutely startling. I think the shock and horror of Jeremy Corbyn's election as the opposition leader has given way to the flow of ideas from Corbyn, but even more so from John McDonnell in recent times. This extraordinary array of ideas of reining in corporatism and corporate capitalism, and the same going on in the US with Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. It's building up an extraordinary head of steam, and I think what we need to do is support that, feed it, spread the word, bring people together, build the solidarity that you're talking about around these ideas, and ensure that those in power don't stop it, basically, because they're obviously trying very hard, but yeah, it's on its way is the feeling that I have. It's on its way incredibly fast.
I think you might be right. Part of me thinks you might be right. And look, we've been having this discussion a lot at GetUp because our economic arm has been trying to socialise some of these ideas, and in fact our members kind of crowd-funded notions of economic policy proposals that would try and shift the Overton window, the window of possibility around debate in this country. And we've been talking this through because we're thinking of doing a speakers tour across Australia with some of these speakers from Corbyn's end and also from Bernie Sanders' end to think about it. And we've been having this debate about how many people do you think will come? Like, are we there in this country or are we not? So it's interesting to hear that. I'm not sure, but I might be able to report back and tell you purely on numbers whether we think we might be getting there.
It's interesting the point you make about the Overton window. So when I took on the, do people know the concept of the Overton window? The limits on, it's a description of the limits on political discourse, basically, that there is this window within which you're allowed to talk about ideas in politics, and ideas outside that window are just not even contemplated in the discourse. And that window seems to me to have radically shifted, actually in both directions, unfortunately, is the problem at the moment, but very much shifted in this direction. When I first took on the job at the Ngara Institute, kind of my remit was essentially to shift the Overton window, was to create space at the green left end of politics to be kind of an IPA at the green left end. And I started coming up with ideas, and by the time I got anywhere on any of them, they were within the window already. It was kind of weird. So it really feels to me like there's so much change. I can throw back to you, the one space it feels to me where it isn't changing is on race. That it's getting worse. I think we both talked about how they're deeply interconnected. And that might be related, I guess, to where I'm feeling hope in the space that I'm working on, and you might not be feeling as much hope. Is that the case?
I think it's a really good question, because it comes back down to that question that I posed all of us here, which is, in your economic vision of possibility, what colour are the people involved in it? And I had this argument with some of Bernie Sanders' people, because if we were to talk the poor in this country just purely on demographics, it's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and it's temporary migrants. And there's lots of others as well, but they are two really, really clear on every indicator that you can get categories. Yet all of this, well, not all, some of the solutions being offered, like for instance, we had this debate about the job guarantee or even shareholders in corporations. What are the odds that the requirement will have to be citizenship or some form of permanent residency? So there you go, you've already excluded this whole pathway. So I think, and this is why I pose the challenge to us, I hold us responsible as well. Because in our visions of the future, if we are not including literally the people around the corner, then what is our future? So I suppose, yeah, that's the place that I'm sitting in. And I think we all of us in the green left space, and those of us who want a progressive vision for this country, need to ask ourselves this question. That's where I'm sitting. So kind of in the middle. Yeah.
There was another question on the tip of my tongue. That's it. So you talk about solidarity, which is an incredibly important concept. I've been doing a lot of reading and thinking around linking that in with environmental thinking and conceptualizing us as part of nature, as part of the natural world, is an interesting stretch on solidarity, in a sense. I think if I can sort of pose the question back to you that you threw to me at the beginning, do you think personally that is a useful thing to do in the space of race relations and prejudice, social prejudice, to expand the terms of that conception of solidarity to include the natural world, or is it too much of a leap?
I just don't think that question can be asked without asking it within the terms of colonisation and indigeneity. Because until you start from the premise that in this country, up until invasion, you had the world's oldest living culture and civilization, living in balance with nature in ways that we still don't even understand or know. And when I say we, I mean mainstream white or settler Australia. And if you don't start there, and if you don't say, I, in my conception of what the world even looks like, cannot actually understand or pose the right questions in terms of nature, because my culture and way of approaching nature is so radically different to those whose lands I stole, then I think you just, when you don't ask the right questions because you don't know the thing, it's like parenting. Your kids ask the question, you're like, it's not the right question, but I see where you're at. And I kind of feel a bit like that about it, to be honest. And I also then ask the question, well, I mean, it's not just Australia's experience. It's the experience of Indigenous communities all across the world and other communities. We have obliterated, as empire marched across the world, these communities, civilizations and ways of being with nature. And so I don't actually know whether us asking the questions is helpful, or whether us vacating the space and leaving the space forward for people who come from those systems who have conserved those ways of thinking is a better option. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. And where I started my presentation in terms of that, thinking of Christopher Stone the original conceptualisation of rights of nature was still very, very much within that Enlightenment, colonialist, industrialist conception. And it's really shifted drastically through that process of it being led by Indigenous politics, essentially. That's really what's informed it in a fascinating way.
I think it's really interesting. But I think there are so many questions about our culture. There are so many questions, even for us as progressives, as people that want something better, about how we go about getting that. And I think the journey matters. And I say this as GetUp, and I say this as somebody who makes compromises all the time to get impact, without a doubt. But I think these spaces are for moments of reflection and self-critique that we can't have outside. You know, that's what I would value about this kind of space. Is starting actually first with that Michael Jackson song, which I still think is the best, which is Man in the Mirror. I'm looking at the man in the mirror and asking what you're doing.
Should we open to questions?
Yes, let's open to questions. So can I borrow your mic?
Sure, go for it.
And if you don't mind sharing.
I've just got a question for Shari about, it's not only the 457 visa holders that actually get caught in the low pay trap, it's also Australian and also other workers. I was wondering if has it ever been thought of actually setting up a fund where people could pay into sort of like a low union, but where once we sort of got a certain proportion of the workers that paid into a fund like that had lawyers behind them, the employers would not be game to take the risk to rip the workers off, because they would never know who was actually covered and who wasn't, particularly if it was actually hidden. So, you know, they wouldn't know if the person was actually paying in the fund or not. But the thing is, if there was one of the people that were paying into a fund, if they did get ripped off, they would have the full force of the lawyers come in and really go down heavily on the employers. And it would only take a few cases like that to happen before the employers would actually start paying people their correct dues.
Well, thank you. I think it's a really interesting question, and I'd like to answer it in two ways. So the first is that this way in which, and look, this is kind of complicated, dense stuff, but the way in which people who are being underpaid have an impact on the rest of the industry. And you can see this in places like hospitality, right, where now we know that underpayment of award wages is rife, and it's in many ways a part of the business model. Like, I have family that's in hospitality, my partner's auntie's in it, and you know, she says often there's no way to make a buck out of this if you don't underpay people. It's absolutely right, and it goes for all workers regardless of their visa status. And so my response to it is somewhat similar to yours, which is, where are the unions and why aren't they all together? Why would you just represent the Australian workers? The whole point of the way that is happening in that industry is that it requires one group to be played off against the other. And so actually at the moment we've just founded a new centre in Melbourne called the Migrant Workers Centre. I sit on the board of the Migrant Workers Centre, and it is an interesting approach where it's bringing together community lawyers and lawyers from the field of employment law and the unions together to actually target this issue and ensure that unions are maximising their support for all workers regardless of their visa status, and bringing them together in ways that lawyers can both assist them, but also workers' collective action together can assist. So yes, I suppose is my response. But you know, it's kind of sad when you think about it. If we've got 1.2 million temporary workers in this country, that a migrant workers centre is only just setting up in Melbourne now. Yeah.
If I can just briefly reflect on the point that you made, that it's impossible to make a buck without effectively oppressing people. Yeah, as was mentioned, I'm also a musician. It's bloody impossible to make a buck in that industry too. In so many industries, this is the case. And I think that ties back to this point about the role of corporations and the way corporations are controlling decision-making processes and and government processes. And there's a lot of people who are trying to do the right thing, but they can't compete with the massive corporations that aren't trying to do the right thing. We can't fix this until we require them to do so, until we break them up, until we change the model that says that their only responsibility is to make a profit for their shareholders. Until we do all of that, we can be fighting a rearguard battle, but we won't actually change the situation.
You're so right, Tim. And to take that example even further, you know, thinking through, like at the moment, the National Farmers Federation and the National Party are in Canberra lobbying vociferously. This issue that I'm about to talk about was apparently one of the National Party's key things to ask Scott Morrison as new Prime Minister. It was the creation of a new agricultural visa, short-term visa for workers, okay? Now, to be able to talk about why our rural and regional farming communities are reliant on short-term migration, you have to talk about the big monopoly or duopoly of the supermarket chains. Yes. You cannot, it doesn't work. It's not like you've got horrible farmers whose only desire in life is to force people to pick blueberries for under minimum wage. But this is what I mean by this giant con that's being perpetuated against all of us. But we have the chance to fix it. Because we're the workers, we're the customers. Business relies on us in that way. So yeah, I totally agree with you on that front. Other questions?
We only have the male half of a political system that is based on logic and reason. It's a very slow-acting system, whereas the original system is based on feeling and intuition. And their conclusion was that until we can find some space where we can bring those two elements together, there is no future in any of our deliberations. So I'm wanting to know how you may see that we can bring those two elements together, because I have my own experiences that we could have stopped the logging 30 years ago from my observation, from all the observation of all of my friends around me. Yet we had to prove over 35 or 40 years that what we were doing. How do we change this system to bring those elements together?
That's digging very, very deep. So I think the point that you started with in terms of colonisation is at the crux of the issue, that colonisation comes from the same process as Enlightenment thinking, which has brought a lot of benefits. It comes from the same process as industrialisation. It comes from the same process of disconnection from each other, from the natural world. It all ties together, and that has been a process which has brought a lot of benefits, medical science, all sorts of things like that. But it is also at the heart of the problems that we face economically, socially, environmentally. So I think it's spot on that we need to find that way back to the holistic way of thinking. What I find fascinating and hopeful is that actually a lot of science is doing that now through an Enlightenment process, actually. Finding the deep interconnections between us, finding the emotional and the integrated next to the rational and disconnected. It's coming back. How we drive that, I'm not sure. I think it's part of the process that a lot of us are talking about, and it is part of, as Shen noted before, the need to step back actually and leave the space. The need for men like me to step back and leave the space for women. The need for settler society to step back and leave the space for Indigenous people to take the lead. There's great importance in doing that. Do you have any?
Thanks, Tim. And thank you for the question, because this is something, I'm going to relate a story, which was a really painful journey for me. So I was a human rights lawyer, which means, and I think maybe a similar background to Tim, I grew up believing the law. You know, I read the law, I thought about the law, I argued it logically. It was about the law. And when I talked about refugees and asylum seekers, I talked about the law and the rights and all of this. The problem is that 15 years of doing this has got us precisely nowhere with public opinion. If anything, 15 years ago, public opinion was 60% supportive of refugees, and when I started to GetUp, it was 25%. I thought, how does this make sense? And so we ran this campaign called Let Them Stay, which I think maybe some of you were involved in. Certainly your Shire was really supportive. And I made a commitment to the refugees about whom that campaign was run. And I said, I will do whatever is necessary to change public opinion. I will test my messaging every single day and we will shift it. And I had this inkling, because there had been some research into this, that perhaps my lawyerly and other people's lawyerly way of talking, logical way of talking, rational way of talking, wasn't helpful. And what I found after running that campaign, we shifted public opinion 15 percentage points in 6 weeks. Now, to give you some level of understanding of how big that is, that's an election, federal election, a swing that would deliver a landslide 3 times over. 5% would deliver a landslide. And we did it telling stories of children and family. I kid you not, I told a story. So we tested this. The way to get people, and it is tied to racism, but when you think about it, the way to get people to care and change their mind was to say, this person likes eggs for breakfast. That was literally it. This person likes eggs for breakfast. She used to fight with her mother because her mother always used to make her wear skirts and she liked to wear pants. One day she fell in love, and then her husband went for a job, didn't get it, annoyed someone, and then the whole world came crashing down because that person was powerful in Iran, and then they had to flee. But what got people was the eggs. And that was a terrible journey for me, and I'm still not sure what the meaning of this is. Are we better people because we care about the human who likes the eggs? Or are we better people because we read a 100,000-page report and we're only convinced when we're told about her rape on the way? But I do think, and this has been something that's been a practice now in campaigning, that there's something to the notion that we aren't fundamentally, or we don't fundamentally change our minds or shift on important issues because of logic and rationality. And the other reason I'd say this is because, hands up of those of you who've been in love. Anybody? Yeah? How many people have done utterly stupid and illogical things because of it? I don't know really how logical we are as people. Because people make the largest decisions on their lives based on absolutely nothing, which is this concept of love that we all feel go absolutely bananas and make stupid decisions all over the place. So yeah, that's my thing. But that is something that I do struggle with as a lawyer now. I don't know if you've been reading The Guardian recently, but they've done a fantastic piece on transparency in the revolving door between politics and lobbyists. And it strikes me that there are a number of practical realities about the way we do politics in this country that contribute to the way in which bad policy outcomes seem to dominate. And I don't know if it's necessarily around traditional cultures, but just take this for a moment. Why would anybody enter politics? Imagine if you were coming from this area, okay? Half the year you were in Canberra. Let's talk federal politics. So just think about that practically. That involves what? Getting a plane from Ballina to where? What, Sydney, or could you go straight to Canberra? Yeah, Sydney, and then what? Go to Canberra? Okay, so that's almost, there's almost an overnight in there. Say politics finishes sitting on a Thursday, you've been there all week, right? You got in there on Sunday night. Politics finishes on Thursday, you rush for the plane to come and get back. You've spent half the year far away from family and friends. What are the odds that your relationship is standing up? All right? Who wants that life? And then after you finish politics, let me tell you, because we had this situation, if you finish politics, who's going to hire you? Do you think you'll get a job at Amnesty or Oxfam? No, because we're politically independent. So what do? Say you finish politics, say you get kicked out at the ripe old age of 45, you get turfed.
And why went to the banks?
The banks. Who takes you? Good question. Like, not just is it dodgy politics, but what are the critical structures around which we have created politics, and who does that attract? Who does it turn away? And what options do we offer? So, and I want to say, Tim, I hope this is okay, Tim, but Tim is, has been pre-selected to run in Canberra, in the newly vacated seat of Canberra. And I applaud him, because I freaking wouldn't do it. And the thing is, we need really good people in politics, but it's a terrible life. And I don't mean to defend them, but it's genuinely terrible.
But we need good women.
But then we need to change politics. Like, we actually need to change not just how people get there, but I mean, you need to change sitting. You need to look at deliberative democracy. Why is somebody, like, let me just ask you a personal question. I've asked you all who you've been in love with anyway, so we're friends. But how good is your decision making if you've spent 5 days away from family and friends in a really weird place where literally I keep seeing people eat chicken nuggets and chips, and not to get all hoity-toity, but if you're eating that 4 days a week, you're making bad decisions. And that's literally, it's called the trough. That's where they eat. I've taken photos of people eating it because I'm like, this is the problem. There's not even a vegan cake in sight, I'm telling you. You'll all be appalled, everyone in Byron Bay Shire. But it's real. And I think, like, I have some sympathy for people because I think it's terrible, and I think we actually need to change politics. And then we will start to see different kinds of politicians. And that's from not just the qualifications, but the practical realities of what politics looks like and what kind of sacrifice is there to be made to go into it, and what happens to even good people, hopefully your family's in Canberra, smart, but good people who go in. You watch their face go. I saw Jed Cunningham, I said, oh, you're looking remarkably human still. Yeah, we need to change all of it, not just the qualifications, and it's not just the fault of people who go into it, because it is still public service, so credit to you.
Thank you.
You will look human, don't worry, I'll check in on you.
The great thing about the seat where I'm running is that Parliament House is inside it.
Yeah.
And there's fantastic food in Canberra. There really is. Not in Parliament House.
This is the
but
thing.
in Canberra there is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robert, for that question. I think the interesting thing is that there are qualifications that we have for the people who are seeking roles of power. Unfortunately, they're the wrong ones, in my estimation. Essentially, you need to prove to become a CEO or to be elected for the major parties, you need to prove that you're a selfish bastard. It's the wrong thing. If you look at the requirements for leadership in Indigenous communities, it is quite the opposite. In the original ways of human organising, you took on a position of leadership by being selfless. In Athenian democracy, it was a selfless commitment, and we can talk about all the problems in Athenian democracy. It was only men, it was only Athenian men, the slavery and all of these issues. However, the commitment to democracy was a selfless commitment. And we need to reclaim that, and I absolutely fundamentally agree we need to radically shift the way we do politics. We do need to bring people back in, we need to change the way sittings work and all that. But fundamentally we need to shift the underpinning drivers of it. We need to reclaim the idea that politics is about the common good, the people coming together to jointly decide our common future, instead of people who demonstrate their selfishness leading for selfishness.
I think that's a great note to end on, and it brings us back to the topic of the evening. So Thank you very much, Tim and Shen, for an amazing evening. Let's give them another warm round of applause just to thank you.